Something devastating happened to the performance of the LA Lakers in 2013. Let's take a look. This diagram shows the percent of games won in each season by the Lakers since 1948. There's a yellow dotted line showing the point at which they've won 40% or more of the games. Between 1948 and 2013, there were only 3 occasions, twice in the 1950s, once in the 1970s, that they fell below that line. There were 2 other occasions where they fell just to 40% or almost to 40% in their entire history. In 2013, they suddenly dropped below the 40% mark. For the first time in their entire history, they had 2 consecutive years spent under the 40% mark. In fact, the following season, not only did they stay under 40%, but they dropped even further than the first year. The third year, they dropped even further. This was unprecedented. In the fourth year, they recovered a little bit, but they still didn't recover their performance to over 40%. Something of catastrophic proportions happened to devastate the Lakers' performance in 2013. Hi, I'm Dr. Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com. My PhD is in nutritional sciences, and today we're going to put our science hats on to try to understand what might have been the cause of this crash in 2013. One thing we know is that in 2013, the Lakers went low carb. Here's a Los Angeles Times article from June of 2013 entitled Gary Vitte's Low Carb Diet for the Lakers. Gary Vitte, up through 2017, served as their athletic trainer since all the way back in 1984. The article says, last summer, Gary Vitte put the Los Angeles Lakers on a diet. Not just any diet, but one based on the theories of Dr. Cate Shanahan, a Napa-based advocate of low carb and, more important, low sugar and high fat eating, as long as the fats are the right ones. The program is similar to the popular paleo diet, preferring meat from pastured rather than grain-fed animals and avoiding carbohydrates and processed food. In December of that year, Ken Berger wrote for CBSSports.com the following in the first article in a long series entitled Nutrition in the NBA. The Lakers program is called Pro Nutrition, which somewhat obtusely stands for Performance, Recovery, and Orthogenesis. The latter being the theory that evolution is strongly influenced by environmental factors such as diet. It seems extreme because it has basically turned the government's sacred food pyramid upside down. Shanahan wants the players to get at least 50% of their calories from fat and no more than 25% each from protein and carbohydrates. Wait, what? That's right. Basically the opposite of what you and everyone else alive have been doing for years. Well, the government's sacred food pyramid isn't the only thing that the Lakers turned upside down in 2013. They also turned upside down their performance and the correspondence between the change in performance and the change in diet seems perfect. Although the decisions about the diet trace back to Gary Vitte, their athletic trainer, and Dr. Cate Shanahan, their strength and conditioning coach from 2011 to 2017, Tim DeFrancesco, was part of this, and he frequently articulated the nutritional philosophy that they were following on his social media. So looking at some of what he's written gives us more insight into what the Lakers were thinking during this time period. In December of 2015, DeFrancesco tweeted that it was a misperception that he and the Lakers were anti-carbs. Not being a fan of carb loading, he wrote, isn't synonymous with no carbs. The following January, he tweeted, everyone has different carb sensitivity, tolerance, and needs. Hard gainers often need more carbs. Find your sweet spot. Although these tweets promote moderation and tailoring the diet to individual needs, DeFrancesco also urged athletes to beware of carb loading. In an article, Straight Answers on Nutrition Choices, in October of 2016, He wrote that one of the problems with athletic nutrition is the belief that carb loading is necessary for athletes. Many athletes are taught, he wrote, that you can't eat too many carbs. Be careful of this. Everyone has their own carb sweet spot. It's important for athletes to be more carb aware and identify what their sweet spot is based on how they feel, activity levels, types, and performance. Seek high-quality intensity carbs over more refined versions. This will set you up for better fuel source flexibility. Although this approach sounds reasonable and nuanced, there's a subtext here that the traditional advice for athletes to fuel their intensity with carbohydrate is misguided, and that most athletes, if they're following the conventional advice, are eating too many carbohydrates and should decrease their carbohydrate intake, consistent with what was written before about the Lakers flipping their carb-to-fat ratios and the food pyramid in general upside down. Some of the rationales that they used to lower their carbohydrate intake just don't make any physiological sense. In an article from April of 2015 called Burn Fat with Fat, Not Sugar, DeFrancesco wrote that carbon dioxide being produced by carbohydrates is a tax that should be avoided. He wrote, you get taxed on converting sugars into ATP differently than you get taxed on converting fat. Within the cell, during the conversion of sugar into ATP, there are 3 compounds of carbon dioxide that are produced as a byproduct of the conversion process. When you bring fat to the cell to be converted into ATP, only 2 compounds of CO2 are produced as a byproduct of the conversion process. Well, this is entirely true. Burning carbohydrate for fuel generates 50% more carbon dioxide than burning fat for fuel. He goes on, in other words, the tax on converting sugar to ATP is 30% greater than when you convert fat into ATP. CO2 makes the cellular environment more acidic. A more acidic cell sounds to me like something to avoid, but here's why it's exactly the opposite of good. The lower pH environment in the cell results in less ATP production by the proton pump. Less ATP equals less available fuel or energy. It's in this second paragraph where this argument just stops making any physiological sense. It's true that carbon dioxide is acidic, but carbon dioxide is a small gas that easily escapes from our cells and we breathe it out in our breath. Carbon dioxide doesn't stay in the cell to acidify it. In fact, during high-intensity exercise, the acidity in the cell is largely driven by lactic acid. But get this, carbon dioxide is critically important to preventing the accumulation of lactic acid and is critically important to delivering the oxygen to your muscles that you need to get that ATP. The diagram on the screen shows part of what's known as the Bohr effect, named after a scientist, Christian Bohr. When hemoglobin in red blood cells delivers oxygen to skeletal muscle, during energy metabolism, we break down food molecules to carbon dioxide. As DeFrancesco was saying, we break fat and carb into carbon dioxide, but we generate more carbon dioxide when we burn carbohydrate. That CO2 leaves the muscle cell, and it acts as a signal that that muscle needs more oxygen because CO2 is the signal that it's engaging in more energy utilization. The CO2 then acts directly on the hemoglobin to cause the release of oxygen so that more oxygen is delivered where it's needed. That oxygen is going to support more ATP production, and oxygen is also what allows us to do high-intensity work without making a lot of lactic acid, so that CO2 is actually going to help us prevent acidification of the muscle cell. Now, although 2013 marks an era in the Lakers' history of using bad physiological science to justify low-carbohydrate diets, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what caused the tanking of performance. Basketball is complex, and it involves training, it involves injury, it involves recovery, it involves lots of things beyond macronutrients. It would be crazy, for example, to completely ignore the effect of the careers of the star players on a basketball team. For example, Kobe Bryant is critical to understanding the success of the Lakers. He played for the Lakers from 1996 through 2016. That's his entire career, and he holds the record for the most consecutive seasons served for any one team. He won 5 championships for the Lakers, was an 18-time All-Star, and scored the most regular season points in the NBA in 2 different seasons. In fact, he ranks 3rd in the NBA for total points scored across his career. Maybe understanding Kobe Bryant's career is the key to understanding what happened in 2013. For example, Kobe Bryant famously sprained his ankle right in 2013 when the performance dropped. Blaming the dip in performance on Kobe Bryant's injury in 2013 is also an attractive hypothesis because he retired in 2016, which could allow us to explain the uptick in performance we see in the season following his retirement. And geez, you can't stay an All-Star forever. The peak of Kobe's career may have been from 1996 through 2013. At some point, performance is going to decline as a star player gets old. When he retired, again we see the uptick, offering another alternative hypothesis centered around the aging of a star player. Or perhaps we could invoke the concept of keto adaptation. Keto adaptation is named after ketones, which are small water-soluble molecules that we make from fatty acids when those are what we're overwhelmingly burning for energy. It's commonly known in the world of low-carbohydrate, ketogenic diets that there's an adaptation period before you get used to fully using ketones or fats for energy. Oftentimes, that period of adaptation is called the keto flu or the low-carb flu until true fat adaptation or keto adaptation occurs. Generally, we think of this lasting weeks. Some people argue months. Well, perhaps the keto flu, in the case of basketball, is going to last 3 years. In that case, we could explain the progressive decline in performance from 2013 to 2016, and the beginning of keto adaptation could have occurred in the last season, explaining the uptick. If keto adaptation takes several more years to fully occur, we may see the Lakers stay on the low-carb diet and return to their previous highs of performance pretty soon to come. Although correlation doesn't prove causation, and although we can invoke alternative hypotheses, it still makes sense to take a look at the biological plausibility that low carbohydrate may have been the reason for the tanking of performance. In skeletal muscle, when we're engaging in high-intensity exercise, there's 3 systems that are going to be important for fueling that exercise. One is called the phosphagen system, and it's composed of ATP and creatine. The second is anaerobic glycolysis. That's the conversion of glucose to lactate. It happens in the absence of oxygen, and it requires glucose, so it's specifically dependent on carbohydrate. The third is aerobic metabolism. That requires oxygen, and we can use protein, fat, or carbohydrate to fuel it. Anaerobic glycolysis, and thus the reliance specifically on glucose, plays a special, unique role in supporting high intensity during certain time intervals. If we have been resting, our creatine supplies are maxed out. We can get away with extremely high intensity work just on our creatine alone, and that represents this line of the phosphagen system. But the phosphagen system, the creatine and ATP, start getting depleted very rapidly. By about 5 seconds of high-intensity work, we're already starting to use the other systems of fuel to support the recycling of that creatine. However, the other systems are anaerobic glycolysis, which requires glucose but can occur in the absence of oxygen, and the aerobic system, which can use any of the macronutrients and needs oxygen. But if you're doing high-intensity work, to get enough oxygen to let the aerobic system take over takes time. It takes time for your breathing rate to increase. It takes time for your heart rate to increase. It takes time for that increase in your heart rate to take the oxygen from your lungs and bring it to a new level inside the muscle cell. In fact, it can take 5 minutes or longer for that aerobic system to truly kick in. What that means is that after 5 seconds of your phosphagen system declining, before you hit that 5-minute mark, glucose, through anaerobic glycolysis, is playing a critical role in allowing you to maintain a certain level of intensity. But in competitive sports like basketball, it goes even beyond this. It's not just about being intense. It's about, in a split second, being more intense than the other player. If you have two athletes with a lot of skill, and they're both going after the same ball in the air, and one wants to keep it going down the same direction on the court, and the other wants to reverse it, it can be a small marginal increase in intensity that allows one or the other player to take control of the ball. If that's the case, even if your aerobic system is well adapted because you've been active for so long, you need to push higher into intensity to outpower the other player by tapping into anaerobic glycolysis to deliver greater intensity than what you could get without it. Now, if the work you were doing at high intensity was so intermittent that you rested minutes between small bouts of intense activity, it's theoretically possible that you could get by on creatine alone without the support of glucose. Shown here is what happens after you've hit exhaustion of your peak intensity when you rest completely. You see the recovery of about 80% of the creatine by close to 2 minutes. As you go up and up, 9 or 10 minutes, you see close to 100%, but not quite. But in basketball, you don't have 5 seconds of intense activity followed by 2 to 5 to 10 minutes of rest. What you have instead is many examples of high-intensity movements with short rests in between them. Shown on the screen is a table that comes from a scientific analysis of elite basketball players under the age of 19, where they watched and quantified all of their movements within a basketball game. What they found was that on average, there were 193 high-intensity movements, such as sprints and jumps, 294 moderate-intensity movements, such as running, 288 low-intensity movements, such as jogging, and 275 recovery movements, such as walking and standing, all of them lasting an average of about 2 seconds. Now, this time spent represented the 47% of time that they were on the court. They spent 53% of the time off the court getting more complete rest. What you have here is lots and lots of high-intensity movements that are going to cumulatively plow through the creatine supply and never enough solid rest for it to recover. That means these athletes are always being pushed into the need for anaerobic glycolysis, the specific requirement for glucose to get high competitive intensity. This can be seen clearly by looking at their blood levels of lactate. Lactate is made from glucose in anaerobic glycolysis, and it signifies the tapping into that system for the greater intensity. You can see that their blood lactate levels from the beginning of the game increase 5 to 7-fold by halftime, and they decline towards the end of the game, but they still stay very elevated compared to the beginning of the game. That shows that throughout the game, the constant tapping into anaerobic glycolysis is causing lactate to accumulate. This shows clearly that glucose is physiologically required to get through a basketball game at competitive intensity. So correlation doesn't prove causation. And yes, there are alternative hypotheses. But basic physiological sense, everything we know about exercise biochemistry and physiology suggests that carbohydrate restriction could cause a competitive athlete's performance to tank, especially in something like basketball. So when we look at the Lakers going low carb in 2013 and seeing that not only did they flip upside down the government's sacred food pyramid and what everyone else had been doing for years, but they also flipped upside down their own performance record, tanking to an unprecedented level of poor performance, then we have to admit that the most plausible explanation for this is in fact carbohydrate restriction caused the performance to tank. Signing off, this is Chris Masterjohn of chrismasterjohnphd.com. I'm glad we solved this. Now let's see what the Lakers are eating next season.